Okay, so I hope you've all had an enjoyable coffee break, and we're now back to some more panels. And our first panel after the break is about OSINT and learning lessons from the experiences coming out of the war in Ukraine. We've obviously seen the widespread use and development of OSINT techniques in the context of the war, in trying to counter disinformation. And this allows us, hopefully, to get better at doing this. Now, I'm relieved now because I get to hand over the chair of this show to Inês Narciso, who is a disinformation researcher with a background, of course, in OSINT. She currently splits her time between dealing with research projects and being a special advisor to the Portuguese cabinet of the Prime Minister. So, welcome, Inês, and it's my pleasure to hand over to you and let you conduct this next panel. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? I think I'm going to sit down over here. So good morning, everyone. I will be accompanied by excellent company today to talk about open source intelligence and the lessons we can learn from the war in Ukraine. On my left, I have Elise Thomas. Elise is a senior OSINT analyst, and she works for the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. They have published some really interesting research reports, and they've been quoted in several very well-known media outlets. So go search for their website, go search for Elise's Twitter. And on my right, I have Benjamin. I've known Benjamin for a couple of years, but never personally, which is quite funny in the OSINT community. Benjamin worked for the BBC. He's done a lot of work in geolocation, OSINT, and he's the director of investigations in the Center for Information Resilience, which also has really interesting work published. So I would also advise you to check not only Ben's Twitter, as his YouTube channel, that has a lot of tips, and also the website of the center. So we are here today because open source intelligence, which I assume most people know, but it's basically publicly available data, okay, that you can ask for, any member of the public can search or ask for, has been growing as a source for reporting on several subjects in which wars that we do not have access to, sometimes physically, is a good example. Now, what has happened in the war with Ukraine is that if you search for OSINT Ukraine, OSINT Russia, OSINT war on Twitter, or even if you do it on Google, you will see that there's a lot of things being produced using this freely available data. Now, this has good points and bad points. Now, I would start by asking Elise, what do you think are the benefits of doing research, OSINT research investigations on the war of Ukraine outweighing the costs?
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely think that the benefit of using open source intelligence, which is the analysis of information that is freely available and freely accessible to anybody to sort of develop insights into what is happening on the ground in Ukraine and in other contexts. I absolutely think that that's been enormously valuable in the context of the war in Ukraine, in terms of tracking what's happening in the front line, in terms of analysis of evidence of potential war crimes, which I'm sure Ben can talk about in more detail. However, as you have said, we've also seen the flip side of that, which is the way in which information can be manipulated, and certainly the appearance and the label of OSINT has been taken by bad actors, including sort of Russian-linked actors, Russian sort of grey zone, state-linked, non-state-linked, a little bit unclear actors, and also sort of because the conflict in Ukraine is obviously such a focus of global attention, also sort of bad actors from other places as well. A lot of the conspiracy theory actors who we've heard about earlier this morning, the people who are sort of responsible for COVID-19 conspiracy theories, the people who sort of developed and mobilized communities around those conspiracy theories and are now in need of a new source of mobilisation and content. We've seen a lot of them get involved in the war in Ukraine as well, and sort of spreading pro-Russian disinformation about the war in Ukraine. Some of you may be aware of the Ukrainian biolabs conspiracy theory, which sort of went very viral around the world, particularly in the US. Again, a lot of the conspiracy theory actors are very active in that space and sort of promoting pro-Russian disinformation. So yeah, on the whole, it's been a positive, but it has been a real mixed bag.
Well, thank you. Ben, you've been using a lot of like satellite imagery and doing a lot of work also on the war in Ukraine. Do you think the fact that this data is more and more readily available to any citizen, is that, what are the boundaries here between, you know, privacy and doing research? How do you feel like when you get like images, footages where there's like children, people involved, or even satellite images that may have some private data? How do you do, like on a daily basis, how do you manage that?
Getting into ethics quite early. I love it. Let's fast forward. Yeah, so I think, you know, around that sort of question of ethics, I think there's something very valuable for all of us that we need to pay attention to, which really comes into the form of digital literacy, right? What we share, how we share, and what information we're putting out to the world. Now, we think about sort of bad actors using that, and I think that comes into this situation that Elise was talking about, and a couple of the conversations we've had with other people around what happens with Russia when they encounter certain bits of information, especially pro-Russian groups. So for an example, one of the ones that we sort of spoke about before was a specific Telegram channel that might look at photos posted in Ukraine. So at the moment, Ukrainian media are not supposed to film tanks, not supposed to film, you know, military vehicles rolling down the streets, or, you know, bases or anything like that. And so there's rules to stop that, specifically because that information can be used in the military context, right? But we have pro-Russian groups, and sometimes some Ukrainian journalists accidentally leak that footage. You know, they might be live streaming, and lo and behold, there's a building in the background. Oops. And we have some pro-Russian groups that operate on Telegram that actually locate these places. They provide these coordinates, and then they send them off. And this isn't the first time we've seen this. If we look back at Syria, for example, I don't know if any of you know this small little group called 4chan. We actually used to have OSINTers on 4chan like we do now on Twitter. 4chan was the hangout for nerdy young white males looking for acceptance, and often they found that acceptance in hangout groups like military groups and things like that. And we noticed that for Syria, they would actually document or try and geolocate, so identify the coordinates of training bases of free Syrian fighters, right? Rebel groups. Then they would say, hey, I've got this friend in the Russian military, Russian Air Force, let's tag him and send it to him. They'd send it to him. Next day, way, 4chan got an airstrike on a rebel group, right, in Syria. We're seeing the exact same thing happen in Ukraine. So everyone sort of rants and raves about the holistic purpose of OSINT and gold standard verification, and we love it. But it's also coming with a bad side. And I think that's kind of one of the conversations that's so integral to many of these places that we don't really talk about. There is a dark side of OSINT, and there are people that can publicly access the same information that we access as NGOs and systematic processes. They access this for the other side as well. And that's quite sort of crucial. So thanks for asking.
Well, really interesting. Yeah, so talking about, as Ben was saying, these ups and downs of OSINT, Elise, do you feel that like the work, for example, that you have done on cryptocurrencies, and the fact that you showed, for example, how in the Donetsk area some people were circumventing sanctions, can OSINT like help NGOs, stakeholders, and on a higher level like governments and international organizations to understand maybe things that they're not aware of, or that, for example, mainstream media are not paying attention to? How can it make a difference, and how can we make sure that that research and that investigation is sound and solid?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yes, absolutely, I think open source intelligence, and by that sort of, it's a very, very broad term, which means a lot of different things, and a lot of it, maybe it's just Google searching, maybe it's just going out and doing a Google search. It's sort of like spending some time sort of actually looking into, in depth, whatever it is that you're working on. So like, yes, obviously that is useful in almost any context. When it comes to sort of specialist areas like cryptocurrency investigations, for example, so the investigation that Inês just referenced is an investigation investigation that I started before the second invasion in 2022 into two cryptocurrencies which were being run by sanctioned members of the leadership of the Donetsk People's Republic in eastern Ukraine. And sort of the astonishing thing there was that these people were under sanctions. They had also a long history of doing Ponzi scams. So this was actually sort of the next step in a decade-long series of Ponzi scams that they'd been running. And the astonishing thing with that was that they were able to do both at the same time. They were able to simultaneously be the sanctioned leaders of this pro-Russian occupation in eastern Ukraine and run a cryptocurrency scam. And that sort of tells you, I think, the degree to which people, particularly in the cryptocurrency space, do not do basic Google searches. Like you could just Google these guys' names and you would have found out that they were sanctioned leaders of the Donetsk People's Republic. And so, yeah, yes, absolutely, it's very valuable. In specialist areas, I think there are areas where you need specialist knowledge, and this comes back to what we were saying before about sort of the flip side of OSINT, and when you get people who, either for malicious purposes or people who are just a bit inexperienced, maybe like don't understand, for example, how to interpret satellite imagery. That is a skill that you need to acquire. So for those areas, you need to sort of take it with a grain of salt or not, you know, like consult an expert if you're looking at satellite imagery, consult an expert if you're looking at cryptocurrency. But yes, it's hugely valuable, and people should Google more.
Google more. So picking up on that, since we are in a room full of people who probably do research on this information, who are interested in this information, if they are looking at an OSINT investigation that debunks or fact checks or somehow kind of deconstructs this information campaign, what would your advice be, Ben, for those people who are reading it? How can like someone who is not an OSINT expert understand what they're looking at? What are the critic points to know if it's, what would your advice be to understand if they're looking at really solid, objective, unbiased material or not?
So I have to critique my own work. Okay, so I think that's that there's a couple of approaches that I'd take, and I think we can sort of use the academic industry as a big one. So research papers, for example, that kind of transparency, right? That open source attitude. So open source actually comes from the old mentality of coders. Is your script open source? Can we peek through the hood of your algorithms and see how that code is being made, right? So that's been introduced into this kind of scientific information space, or this journalism meets deep level physics and chemistry space. So we've got that kind of open source mentality, and I think that's core to it, that transparency. I often like to use the analogy of cooking a cake. So when we look at a piece, we often see a finished product, like a nice, beautiful cake. And that's often what we hand off to prosecutors, what we submit to media as well, what we submit to government for sanctions, as Elise was talking about. So we've got that finished cake. But we also have the recipe and the ingredients as well. And that's core when you're looking at a good open source investigation. You're not just seeing a cake and being like, oh, okay, that's pretty cool, I love that, but I don't know how it was made. I don't know what ingredients are in there whatsoever. You want to have a look at the back of the packet of that cake and see the ingredients and poke under the hood, but you also want to see the recipe on how it was gained. For example, if I wrote a piece about Russia and I started that research saying, I'm going to write a piece about how Russia's really bad, well, actually, I should be sort of approaching that thinking, okay, I'm going to write a piece about the Russian space and let the facts tell the story. Because otherwise, we're letting the facts tell a story that we want to tell. And that's kind of a little bit more, I'd hate to say it, journalistic or colourful writing in a sense. We're using facts to tell our narrative. So I think that approach in the recipe and using those ingredients that other people can replicate, and that goes into something that we were talking about before, which is around prosecutions, around media, around governments. They want to have trust by being able to do the work themselves, right? So if they're able to bake that cake themselves, if they're able to get those ingredients themselves, that's a kind of trustworthy product that I have faith in, and hopefully others do as well. So if you see a final product like that, you should be able to poke under the hood, have a look at the recipe and have a look at the ingredients as well.
Thank you. Well, before we start our Q&A, I would like to thank both our presenters and for their important lessons. I would start the Q&A doing a question myself, and then I'll give it over to the audience. Do you think the war in Ukraine and what OSINT has been revealing will be beneficial or bad for the OSINT community?
I think it's a little bit of both. Like, I think the OSINT community, I think even 5 years ago, and maybe correct me if I was wrong, it was very small. It was sort of a handful of very nerdy people spending a lot of time in front of their computers who were just very interested in satellites or very interested in cryptocurrency. And I think what we've seen with the war in Ukraine is OSINT has become it's become the kind of concept that you get invited up to sit on a stage and talk about. Like, it's become a little bit of a buzzword, a little bit of a label, a little bit of a content stream, and there are pluses and minuses with all of that. One is that you get more attention and more funding, which is great. The flip side is that you get all of the negatives that come with a hype cycle. So you get a lot of commercial actors, people who are sort of sensing money and sort of coming to do work. But for example, I don't know if there's anybody from any of the large consultancy companies here, but they are starting to move into that space. You get a lot of people. Also, sort of, particularly during the war in Ukraine, we've seen the emergence of sort of quote-unquote OSINT influencers, so people who run very big Twitter accounts that just sort of pump out this very low-grade stuff, some of which is wrong, some of which is okay, some of which is, dubious, and some of which, as I said, sort of exists in this sort of hazy pro-Russian, are they state actors, are they not state actors, we don't really know. And so all of that, there's the pluses and the minuses that come with sort of there being a lot of attention now on this kind of work. I would say also, I think there's a couple of other sort of interesting trends that we've seen in not so much the OSINT space, but in the disinformation space in general in Ukraine. One is the rise of crowdsourcing. So particularly pro-Russian actors are using a lot of crowdsourcing, which, if you had to guess, you'd say there's probably a core there of sort of state direction, but there's also sort of a lot of people who are getting involved because it's fun, because they're genuine supporters of Russia, because of sort of that, as Ben was saying, that sort of that 4chan trollish urge to cause a bit of damage. So there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of doxing. So sort of the publishing of sort of the details of ordinary Ukrainians, ordinary supporters of Ukraine, a lot of doxing targeting particularly the Ukrainian army and members like grassroots levels of the grassroots members of the Ukrainian military, singling them out, publishing their names, their addresses, their phone numbers, their parents' names and addresses and phone numbers, particularly focusing again on LGBTQ service members. We've also seen, as Ben was saying, the co-option of OSINT. So we've seen several large sort of groups which are sort of purporting to do OSINT and are in fact producing disinformation, for example, about the atrocities in Bucha, for example, which they then sort of do up with the appearance of an OSINT investigation. So they'll give you like the little pictures with the little pointy arrows and the colourful boxes, and it looks enough superficially like an OSINT investigation that if you don't understand what you're looking at, you go, yeah, that looks pretty much the same. And so we're seeing a lot of that, and I think those are sort of three significant developments in the way that the disinformation space, particularly the sort of the Russian disinformation space, is changing.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to go off the back of that. I think Elise has covered so much. I guess some extra aspects, and coming sort of from the more accountability side, which a lot of people love that buzzword around justice and accountability. But I think we've started to identify what that actually means, and it means something to very different audiences. So for a group here, accountability might mean a war crimes case in the ICC. That's very important, but and I just came back from Kiev, where people from the ground are actually, and many from the regional areas aren't looking for accountability from the ICC, but they're just looking for simple accountability and representation of those victims, their family members. And so I think OSINT really has started to find a role in not just documenting the conflict on the ground, so when a tank rolls past on a street, when a shot is fired, when someone is killed, but it also shows that other side of the battle that is often unheard, but the battle that everyone here works around, which is the impact of the information space. And now we're starting to see the fusion of those two battles. Oftentimes we've had a look at these battles. So for example, we've seen leaflet drops in the past in conflicts, World War I, World War II. We've seen age-old propaganda, but that fusion of what's happening in the information space, it's so hard to track, that battle in the information space, fusing that information with the battle on the ground is so crucial. And we're seeing a couple of impacts in that in a number of senses. So for example, prosecution efforts, which we're supporting the Prosecutor General's office in Ukraine, they're documenting war crimes, but now, instead of just focusing on what happens on the ground, they're also looking at the mens rea, so the mental element. It's not just the actus reus of firing artillery into a specific place in Chernihiv and killing a group of civilians waiting in a bread line, but also having a look at the mens rea, which is the information space. What's Russia saying about this event? Have they suddenly enacted a huge disinformation propaganda campaign to deny these events? Perhaps that might go in stage to actually say, Russia knew about this, and now they're trying to undermine the evidence because they knew what happened. So these kind of two things that we're really seeing in this space is quite important, because we're fighting a war on the ground and we're fighting a war in the space at the same time. But thinking about those audiences is something that we're shaping more and more in this Ukrainian conflict. It's not just about justice and accountability in the courts. It's about representation of the victims on the ground. It's about the sanctions, and it's about providing evidence to further that effort, such as platform takedowns, media efforts, so trust in actual war crimes investigations, and things like that, that we're really seeing the full package happening in front of us.
Well, thank you for that amazing wrap-up. I think it gave us a lot of food for thought. We don't have that much time because we're already kind of running back on our schedule. So I would say a couple of questions, like 2 questions. I see some hands over there, some hands over here.
You want me to stand up, or I'll just sit down? So, I love you two guys. You're wonderful. I'm fangirling over here.
Okay.
One question I have is the OSINT, as you said, is it's open source. It's a very collaborative work. Sometimes I'm watching a collaborative investigation unfold online, and half-baked ideas get thrown out and picked up, and then suddenly it just spreads out and becomes the dominant analysis. And we're really waiting for a few actors that we know are good, you two included, who are actually provided decent analysis. But what I'm wondering is, with attention economics and this diffusion of information, is that really a good way to go about it? Because a lot of half-baked analysis are getting out and later discouraged. Some people are extremely bad at deleting those analyses afterwards, and they just have this zombie life afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this earlier. Like, I don't know who saw the hashtag China coup thing that went around sort of I don't know, like a month or two ago, where basically everybody on Twitter in certain spaces was kind of convinced that there was a coup in China based on absolutely nothing. There was sort of some very, very bad, like, quote unquote, like OSINT investigations that I think they thought there was some tanks going somewhere. I don't know, but yeah, it sort of came out of nowhere. It was based on nothing, and it went viral globally. I had my mother, who's not involved in this at all, like asking me, what's happening in China? Is there a coup in China? No. And I think that is the first ripple of a big wave. Like, I do think this is going to be a significant problem. As you said, the platform dynamics sort of propel the most sort of exciting information forward and sort of do not propel the boring truth in the same way. As I was saying before, the rise of these like sort of OSINT influencers as well. You have all of the dynamics that come along with kind of the influencer ecosystem. So there's money for one. If these people are running Patreons or sort of they're doing crowdfunding in other ways, there's a financial element. But there's also just kind of the clout, the prestige that comes with having some of these sort of like Twitter threads that are getting 100,000 retweets. So yes, that's a big problem, and no, it's not a good way of doing it. The flip side is sort of how you maintain that kind of open, collaborative nature of OSINT, which I think is extraordinarily valuable. And I think it's really important that we don't start gatekeeping, because there are some brilliant, almost everyone I know who works in OSINT is self-taught. And started because they were just really, really interested. Everybody started as some random person on Twitter. And I think that is such a wonderful, important thing. It's such an important part of keeping the creativity and the dynamism in this space. But it's sort of, yeah, and that I think is sort of the issue that we are struggling with now, how you maintain the quality without erecting gates that keep great people out.
Yeah, I think Elise has pretty much answered it. I just think on top of that, there's a general trend that OSINT is a little bit of hype at the moment. So it does get likes, it does get retweets, it does get media mentions, and generally a silence in the battle, the first shot is always the loudest. And no matter what analysis might be done 6 months later or 12 months later, the one to first land that shot, the one to first ring out that loud bullet, that crack thump in the air, is the loudest one at all times. And that's what we're really seeing on Twitter, primarily. And that really echoes out because Twitter is a haven of journalists, media, politicians, people active in the space. And yeah, it's much easier to make something up on the spot or make something fit your narrative than it is to do a forensic analysis and a deep analysis. So there is an issue there, and I think that's one of the growing trends. You know, it's a really important question, and hopefully maybe the next conference we might see someone actually present on how to mitigate those risks.
Thank you. Next question. I think we have one over here.
Thank you very much for your very interesting insights. I wanted to ask Elise in particular a little bit more about the investigation that you led into cryptocurrency, any findings that you're willing to share, but also what you learned that it might be specific to disinfo around that conflict by doing that.
Sure. So you can go and read it for yourselves. It's on the Centre for Information Resilience's website. It's called The Separatist's Guide to Circumventing Sanctions. But essentially, like some of you may or may not be aware that Denis Pushilin, who is the current head of the Donetsk People's Republic, his previous career was as a multi-level marketing scammer / Ponzi scammer. And a bunch of the people who were kind of involved in that leadership group also came with him from this giant Ponzi scam that was active in Russia and then internationally in kind of the late 2000s to the early 2010s called MMM. And what this investigation was into, and I should say that, so this investigation was published, I was putting the finishing touches on it just as the 2022 invasion was starting, so it predated the current invasion. But what this investigation was into was the fact that actually they just never stopped Ponzi scamming. Like even as they moved into participating in the 2014 invasion and then sort of gradually became, as Pushilin became the leader of the Donetsk People's Republic, and actually one of the people who allegedly, according to Ukrainian intelligence, helped him to assassinate the previous leader of Donetsk People's Republic. He was also running one of these cryptocurrencies. As they did that, they continued to run this global cryptocurrency, which looks very, very, very much like a Ponzi scam. Essentially, it's the same scam that they were running before, but with a layer of like cryptocurrency buzz sort of layered over the top of it. And the victims of this scam, kind of first and foremost, are the people whose money they're stealing. MMM, the big Ponzi scam they were involved in earlier on, stole the savings of potentially millions of people worldwide. And these cryptocurrency scams they were running preyed on particularly developing countries. They were very active in India, very active in Africa, very active in sort of parts of Southeast Asia. And stole, we don't know exactly how much money they stole, but obviously it was enough for them to continue to be motivated to do it for many, many years. So that investigation, it's quite long, it's quite detailed, but if you're interested, I would definitely say check it out. It's a very weird one, but it's sort of darkly funny at some points, but it's, I think, a good illustration of the amount of stuff that you can get away with in the cryptocurrency space. Like the really striking thing for me is that there are no meaningful gatekeepers in the cryptocurrency space. They were known for doing this. As I said, you could have just Googled their names and you would have known who they were. And yet nobody, it seems, was either able to or was interested in stopping them from doing it again. And we know already that Russia, including the Russian government, but also sort of Russian corporations, Russian high net worth individuals are using cryptocurrencies to evade sanctions. We know they're doing a lot of that via particularly like sort of private offices in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi. A lot of like Russian money is moving via cryptocurrency from there into real estate or into other forms of cryptocurrency. We had a Russian government official just a couple of weeks ago come out and say publicly that Russian corporations are actually moving ahead of Russian legislation, that they're already moving to facilitate cross-border payments with unfriendly countries to sort of buy products and services they need. So we know that this is happening. And I think that sort of that question of, again, how to kind of manage cryptocurrency space is a really significant one.
Thank you so much, Elise. I think we have a last question here from the front. For those of you who do have questions that you didn't manage to make, I would ask you to talk to Elise, and then at some break, we'll be here today and tomorrow. Go ahead.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex. I have a small question. We've been doing OSINT, and I was discussing with investigative journalists yesterday that told me that independent journalists, media are not interested in covering investigation on war crimes because it doesn't sell that many paper. So paying journalists for that is not really a good stuff. And I'm adding an extra question, like, is it our job actually as a community, and maybe it's a new job, we fought for the truth and for true things to be revealed and to be exposed, but do we also need to fight for justice? And who is the responsibility to go forward when we expose things, when we take risks? Who is going to the next steps? We just raised an investigation recently. We would need to follow up with at least 5 or 6, 7 different regulation authorities in Europe. Not everybody has the means to actually follow up on that. So how do you think it should work in that space for having evidence and having accountability being ensured?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. So I think on the kind of the latter parts around resources, obviously newsrooms have KPIs to hit, they have a beat to hit. Investigative teams less so. So I think that there's that aspect. It's not easy for news desks to really dig deep into this stuff over 6 months or 12 months, as it does take to build up a war crimes case. However, I think there is collaboration that can happen. So we've seen, and for us personally, we've done, I think, over the past month, at least 20 collaborations with international news media platforms on war crimes cases, influence operations, propaganda, and other content similar to that margin. And so I think that's also happening more and more in this space. We've got Bellingcat as well, who's very much open to media collaborations, and a lot of independent analysts as well. So as Elise said before, and myself, you have the kind of Twitterati of OSINTers, if you trust them, to work with them, with media agencies, with CSOs and NGOs. So there's that sort of applicability to not just keep it siloed. And again, I think the modus of OSINT and open source intelligence, keep it open. So in intelligence spheres in the government, often information is siloed. One analyst sits in a dark room, not necessarily dark room, usually plush, but they sit in a room and they keep information to themselves because it's classified, things like that. But what we have is intelligence that's not classified. There's no red stamp on it. So I could share it with you. I can collaborate with anyone I want, as long as you're good. And I think on that aspect, and same as Elise as well, she's also open to collaboration. And in that aspect, if we don't have resources within ourselves, if we collaborate, maybe we can halve the problem. And that's the biggest thing that we started at the start with this second invasion of Ukraine, is the aspect that this problem is too big for one organisation to deal with it. And so we immediately teamed up with Bellingcat, with a number of NGOs, with a group on Twitter called GeoConfirmed, who are a group of armchair analysts. And we started sort of building that map straight away. You can have a look at the map on your phone right now. It's called Eyes on Russia. It's a publicly available map with geolocated, verified videos and photos from social media that's updated every day or every week, with content of what's happening in Ukraine. That is not able to be done by one single organisation, and we don't have the resource to do that. That is now being used by judicial applications, by judicial mechanisms to investigate war crimes, because they cannot verify all that information themselves as well. One of us is not the answer to this problem, but all of us together, if we bond together and collaborate, that community is what can be used to address that problem. Elise?
Oh, yeah, no, I would agree with all of that. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go as a team.
Well, thank you very much. I think this deserves a round of applause. So I will pass it on to the next panel that I think will be also really interesting. Thank you very much for your attention.